The night my mother threw us out, it was 30 degrees and the Christmas lights on the neighbor's oak tree kept blinking like nothing was wrong. I remember the exact sound of our suitcases hitting the porch boards. Not a dramatic crash. Just a flat, dull thud, the kind of sound that means someone made a decision about you and already moved on. The front door closed behind us, and through the frosted glass panel I could see the warm orange glow of the living room. The tree we hadn't decorated. The candles she'd bought from some boutique in the new part of town. The life she was building that had no square footage left for us in it. My grandfather Raymond stood next to me in his wool cardigan, the gray one with a loose button on the third snap that I kept telling him I'd fix. He was 78 years old. He had a suitcase with a broken wheel, a plastic bag with his medications, and a tin of butter cookies he'd bought for the grandchildren who weren't coming anymore. He looked at the door for exactly 3 seconds. Then he looked at me and said, "You know what sounds good right now? A hot chocolate from a vending machine." I didn't laugh, but I wanted to, even then. My name is Nadia. I was 24 years old when this happened, recently graduated, working my first real job as a junior financial analyst at Clearfield Group, a regional firm that handled investment portfolios for mid-market business clients. I was good at my job. Not in a braggy way. Just in the way where your manager stops double-checking your spreadsheets after the 3rd month. Numbers made sense to me. Patterns made sense to me. I had grown up watching my grandfather balance his checkbook at the kitchen table every Sunday morning with a cup of black coffee and a red pen, and somewhere in those Sunday mornings, I had absorbed something useful. Raymond was my mother's father. He'd raised her alone after my grandmother passed in 1994. Lung cancer, fast and merciless, and he had done a quiet, steady job of it. He was not an effusive man. He didn't say, "I love you," every 5 minutes or make big speeches at birthday parties. What he did was show up. Every single time. When my father left, I was 9, it was a Tuesday in March, and he took his guitar and his duffel bag, and that was the end of that. Raymond was at our door by Thursday with a bag of groceries and a board game and absolutely zero commentary about my father. He just sat down at the table and asked me what I was learning in school. He was that kind of man. After college, when I was trying to stack enough savings to get my own place in a city where a 1-bedroom cost $1,800 a month minimum, Raymond offered me the back bedroom in his house on Millbrook Road. The house was a 1960s craftsman. 3 bedrooms, original hardwood floors, a kitchen that always smelled like coffee and, depending on the season, either the candles he bought from the drugstore or whatever I was burning on the stove. It was the most stable address I had ever lived at. I paid him $400 a month, which he put in an envelope and then tried to give back to me every time something broke in the house. I started hiding the envelope before he could find it. That house was home. For both of us. And then my mother married Gerald Holt, and everything that felt permanent started to dissolve. Margaret, my mother, was 51 when she married Gerald. He was 58, twice divorced, and owned 3 car dealerships in the county. He wore a signet ring on his right hand and had opinions about wine that I suspected he had memorized from a magazine. He was not a cruel man exactly. He was the kind of man who is accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around him, and when they don't, he simply applies pressure until they do. My mother had been dating him for 8 months before the wedding. She'd known him 11 months before that. By the time they exchanged vows at a venue that charged $12,000 for the Saturday rental, she had already started referring to Raymond's house as the situation we need to figure out. That phrase should have told me everything. But I stayed. Because Raymond was there. And because some part of me genuinely believed that my mother, underneath all the new perfume and the catered dinner parties, was still the woman who used to braid my hair on Sunday mornings in Raymond's kitchen. I was wrong about that. And it would take a porch, a motel, and a tin of butter cookies to finally make me see it clearly. Here's what I want you to understand before we get to Christmas Eve. What happened on that porch was not a single bad decision made in a moment of cold weather cruelty. It was the last step in an 18-month process of erasure that my mother and Gerald had been quietly, methodically executing since the week after their honeymoon. Started with language. Before Gerald, my mother called Raymond Dad. Always had. Even in arguments, even in the tense years after my father left, he was Dad. Then, somewhere around month 3 of the marriage, he became Raymond. Just like that. No announcement, no explanation. One Sunday call she said, "I talked to Raymond this week," and I remember pausing for a second, like I'd heard a note played in the wrong key. I didn't say anything. I told myself it meant nothing. But language is never nothing. Language is always a map of how someone has started to see you. By month 5, the reframing had escalated. Gerald started referring to the house on Millbrook Road as the property. Not Raymond's house. Not even your grandfather's place. The property, like it was a line item in a spreadsheet rather than the address where a 78-year-old man kept his coffee mug and his dead wife's china and the garden he'd maintained for 31 years. The first concrete incident happened at the 4th of July barbecue, 7 months into the marriage. My mother had organized it at the house. Her idea, her guest list, mostly Gerald's friends and their wives. Raymond had cleaned the backyard, set up the folding tables, and made his potato salad, the one with the celery and the paprika that people had been requesting for literally 2 decades. He carried it out in the same yellow ceramic bowl he always used. Gerald's friend, a man named Phil, commercial real estate, the kind of loud that fills a room before you know his name, looked around the yard and said to Gerald within earshot of Raymond, "Beautiful property. You two should really get this in Margaret's name before he's gone. Just smart planning." Gerald nodded like this was a perfectly reasonable thing to say in front of the man who had mowed that yard since 1991. Raymond said nothing. He set the potato salad down. He went back inside. And I watched my mother not follow him. Followed him. I found him in the kitchen, refilling the ice bucket that didn't need refilling. I stood next to him and didn't say anything for a minute. He handed me a glass of iced tea. We stood there. Finally I said, "You heard that?" He said, "I've got good ears." I said, "I'm sorry, Grandpa." He said, "Don't be sorry. Be useful." I didn't know what that meant yet. The second incident was Thanksgiving. Margaret had decided, jointly with Gerald I'm sure, over some dinner where Raymond's comfort was not on the agenda, that the holiday would be hosted at Gerald's house. Not Millbrook Road. Gerald's house, which was a newer build in the Crestview development. All open floor plan and quartz countertops and a dining room table that seated 12 people Gerald wanted to impress. Raymond was invited. Technically. What that invitation looked like in practice. He was seated at the far end of the table, beside Gerald's 9-year-old grandson and a cousin nobody seemed to know well. The conversation at the main end of the table, Gerald's end, was about the dealerships, about a property investment in the next county, about a ski trip plan for February. Raymond sat with his turkey and his small talk and his dignity, and nobody asked him a single question for the duration of the meal. At one point Gerald's daughter, Tara, mid-30s, the kind of thin-lipped politeness that is really just hostility with better posture, leaned over to my mother and said, loudly enough for me to catch it 2 seats away, "How much longer does he plan to stay in that house? It seems like a lot of upkeep for someone his age." My mother said, and I will never forget this as long as I live, "We're working on it." Working on it. Like he was a project. Like he was a problem that had a solution they were approaching on a timeline. I looked at Raymond. He was cutting his turkey with the same precise, unhurried movements he used for everything. If he'd heard, and he had good ears, he gave nothing away. I excused myself to the bathroom and stood over the sink for 2 full minutes. By December, the pressure had shifted from subtle to structural. My mother started calling me separately from her calls to Raymond, which was new and pointed. She'd ask questions designed to feel like concern. "Do you think the house is getting to be too much for him? Has he mentioned wanting to simplify?" She suggested twice, that Raymond might be happier in an assisted living community she'd found in the next town. The monthly rate was $3,200. She mentioned it with the energy of someone who had already made the decision and was now auditioning my agreement. Raymond was 78. He drove himself to the pharmacy. He gardened. He balanced his own finances. He had, 2 months prior, beaten Gerald at chess in under 40 moves and been gracious enough not to mention it afterward. He did not need assisted living. What he needed was to be left alone in his own home. But that was the one thing my mother had stopped being willing to give him. And then Christmas Eve arrived, and she stopped pretending there was any negotiation left. December 24th. I know the temperature because I checked my phone when we were standing on the porch. 29 degrees. Feels like 23 with a wind chill. I remember the number because it seemed almost theatrical, like even the weather was making a point. The day had started normally enough. I'd come home from work at 4:30, picked up milk and eggs and a small poinsettia from the grocery store because Raymond liked having one on the kitchen table in December. He'd been in good spirits. We'd had soup. There was a Christmas movie on the television that neither of us was really watching. My mother arrived at 6:15 with Gerald and Tara's husband, whose name I still have trouble remembering because he barely spoke. They came in like a committee. My mother was wearing a fur coat, long ivory, the kind of coat that announces itself. She'd had it 3 weeks. She'd mentioned it on 2 phone calls. She was wearing it like a credential. She didn't sit down. That was the first signal. When someone arrives at a house and doesn't sit down, they aren't visiting. They're executing something. Gerald stayed near the door. Tara positioned herself by the hallway in a way that, looking back, I can only describe as tactical. My mother stood in the center of the living room and looked around at the furniture, the walls, the photographs on the mantel. Raymond's wife, Raymond's kids at various ages, a photo of me at 7 in a yellow raincoat, and her face arranged itself into an expression I can only describe as finality. Raymond was in his chair. He looked up at her. She said, "We need to talk about the house." He said, "All right." She said, "Gerald and I have decided that we'd like to begin the transition process. After the new year, we'll be listing the property. There are estate planning considerations that make this the right move and..." Raymond said quietly, "This is my home, Margaret." She paused for exactly 1 beat. Then she said, "And I want you to understand that she said this to a 78-year-old man who had raised her alone, who had worked for 35 years as a civil engineer, who had never asked her for a single thing." She said, "This isn't your house anymore, Dad. It hasn't been really for a while. You just haven't been willing to see it." The room did not make a sound. I stood up. I said, "Mom, you need to stop." She looked at me with an expression that was somehow both sad and completely unmoved. She said, "Nadia, this doesn't involve you." I said, "He is my grandfather. It absolutely involves me." Gerald cleared his throat. He said, "We've had documents prepared. There's really no reason for this to be a difficult conversation. Raymond, you'd be much more comfortable somewhere." "I am comfortable," Raymond said. Still quiet. Still entirely still. "I've been comfortable here for 31 years. My mother pressed. She said they'd found a facility. She said it was lovely. She said the timing made sense, given everything. She did not define what everything meant. She didn't need to. Everyone in the room understood that everything meant Gerald and Tara, and the listing price they'd probably already researched, and the fact that Raymond's comfort had become an obstacle. When he didn't agree, when he simply sat in his chair and looked at her with an expression I can only describe as sorrowful recognition, like someone watching a thing they'd feared finally arrive, she made the decision that I don't think she'd planned to make that night but made anyway, the way people do when they've built up enough conviction that it starts making choices for them. She told us to pack a bag. She said she and Gerald would be staying at the house for the holiday, and that it would be better for everyone if Raymond and I found somewhere else for the next few days while they got things in order. I looked at her and I said, You're asking your 78-year-old father to leave his own house on Christmas Eve. She said, I'm not asking. We were on the porch by 7:40 p.m. Raymond had one suitcase, his medications, and the tin of butter cookies. I had my overnight bag, my laptop, and my work tote because some reflex in me had grabbed it automatically. The way you grab something you trust when everything else is wrong. The door closed. The lock turned. I heard Tara say something inside that made Gerald laugh. And the sound of it hit me somewhere I didn't have a word for. Raymond looked at the Christmas lights on the neighbor's oak tree for a moment. Then he looked at me. Motel 6 takes pets, he said. And I've always liked that about them. We didn't have a pet. That was just Raymond. The motel off Route 9 was $74 a night. Room 114. It smelled like industrial cleaner and carpet that had seen better decades. And the heater made a clicking sound every 4 minutes that I started counting because it was something to count. Raymond sat on the edge of the bed nearest the window and investigated the vending machine options I'd photographed on my phone, because he'd refused to walk outside in the cold again. Doritos, peanut butter crackers, or what appears to be a very optimistic granola bar, he said. I got him the peanut butter crackers. I got myself the Doritos. I sat on the floor with my back against the bed and ate them and cried, quietly, in a way I thought he couldn't hear. He could hear. He had good ears. He didn't say anything maudlin. He didn't tell me it would be okay or that everything happened for a reason. He put his hand briefly on the top of my head, the way he used to when I was small and upset about things I couldn't articulate. Then he said, Nadia, I need you to trust me about something. I looked up. Whatever happens in the next few weeks, I need you to not do anything. No calls, no lawyers, no confrontations. Can you do that? I said, What do you mean, a few weeks? He said, There's a meeting coming. I need you to just show up to it. I wiped my face on the sleeve of my sweatshirt and said, What kind of meeting? He picked up the television remote, clicked to a channel showing old Christmas specials, and said simply, The kind where the right people find out what they actually own. I didn't sleep much that night. But something in me, the part that had spent 2 years watching him be underestimated, watching him absorb it with that quiet, unhurried patience, that part had started to understand. Raymond had not been silent because he was powerless. Raymond had been silent because he was waiting. The call came on a Tuesday, January 14th. I was at my desk at Clearfield Group, halfway through a portfolio reconciliation report, when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. A 617 area code, local professional cadence when the man on the other end spoke. Is this Nadia? Said yes. My name is David Carreño. I'm an attorney. I've represented your grandfather, Raymond, since 1987. He's asked me to contact you directly regarding a scheduled family meeting. It will be held at my office on January 21st at 2 p.m. Attendance is required for all named parties. I said, Named parties in what? There was a brief pause. Not an uncomfortable one. A practiced one. The pause of a man who has delivered information in careful sequences for 30-plus years, he said. In the estate documentation. Your grandfather wanted you to hear the details in the room, with everyone present. But he did ask me to tell you one thing in advance. Waited. He said to tell you, bring something to write with. You'll want to take notes. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, Mr. Carreño, can you tell me, how long have these documents been in preparation? Another practiced pause. The most recent revision was finalized on September 9th. September 9th. I ran the calendar backward in my head without even meaning to. The financial analyst reflex, always locating events on a timeline. September 9th was 4 months before Christmas Eve. It was 2 weeks after the 4th of July barbecue where Gerald's friend Phil had suggested putting the house in my mother's name. It was 6 days after Raymond had beaten Gerald at chess and been gracious enough not to mention it. Raymond had heard Phil's comment at that barbecue. He'd gone inside to refill an ice bucket that didn't need refilling. And then, apparently, he'd called his lawyer. I didn't tell my mother about the meeting. Raymond had been clear. No calls, no confrontations, nothing that would disturb whatever sequence he had set in motion. I honored that. It was the hardest 11 days of my adult life, but I honored it. What I did instead was research. Quietly, methodically, the way I'd been trained to build a financial picture from disconnected data points. I pulled the county property records online. Public information, anyone can access them. And searched the address on Millbrook Road. What I found stopped me cold. The deed on the property had been updated. The recorded date was October 3rd. 6 weeks after the barbecue, 10 weeks before Christmas Eve. The update was not a transfer of ownership. It was something more specific. Raymond had placed the property into a revocable living trust. The trust was named, and I had to read this 3 times. The Millbrook Road Family Trust, established for the benefit of Nadia Damwai name. On a trust document, filed with the county clerk's office in October, while my mother was presumably shopping for fur coats and researching assisted living facilities. I called Carreño's office the next morning. His assistant answered. I didn't ask to speak with him. I knew he wouldn't be able to tell me much before the meeting. I just asked one question. I said, "Can you confirm that the trust recorded on October 3rd at the county clerk's office is part of the estate documentation being discussed on the 21st? She put me on hold for 90 seconds. Then she came back and said, "Mr. Carreño asked me to tell you, yes. And also, your grandfather said you'd call." I want to explain something about Raymond that I don't think I've made fully clear yet, because it matters for understanding what he built and how he built it. Raymond worked as a civil engineer for 35 years. He retired at 67 with a pension, a paid-off house, and a stock portfolio he had been quietly, consistently contributing to since 1978. Not aggressively. Not with flash or speculation. He bought index funds and dividend stocks and he reinvested everything and he left it alone, the way a gardener plants something and has the patience to not dig it up every season to check the roots. By the time I was in college, I knew vaguely that he was comfortable. He didn't talk about money the way people who are anxious about money talk about it. He talked about it the way people who understand it do. Briefly, specifically, without drama. What I did not know, what none of us knew apparently including my mother, was the specific number. I would learn that number on January 21st. And I will tell you right now. It was not a number my mother had imagined when she was pricing out assisted living facilities. The private envelope arrived at my office on January 19th, 2 days before the meeting. Carreño's return address. My name, handwritten on the front in the particular slanted cursive I had seen on birthday cards and grocery lists and Sunday checkbook entries my entire life. Raymond's handwriting. I held it for a long time before I opened it. Inside was a single index card. 4 lines. I am not going to read them to you yet, because Raymond timed everything deliberately, and the note was designed to be read after the meeting, not before. He'd written that on the envelope. Open after. I put it in the inside pocket of my blazer. I ironed the blazer that night for the first time in 3 months. January 21st. 1:47 p.m. I arrived at Carreño's office 13 minutes early. The building was a converted Victorian on Hargrove Street. Solid, unpretentious. The kind of office that communicates competence without trying to impress anyone. The receptionist showed me to a conference room on the 2nd floor. Dark wood table, 8 chairs, a window that looked out onto the street below. I chose a seat on the side facing the door and put my notepad on the table in front of me. I sat there alone for 9 minutes. At 1:56, I heard them coming up the stairs, my mother's voice first. That particular elevated register she uses in professional settings, the one she'd developed sometime in the last 18 months, and that still sounded faintly like a costume. Then Gerald's heavier footsteps. Then Tara. Then Tara's quiet husband. They came through the door and my mother saw me and paused for just a fraction of a second. Surprise maybe that I was already there, already settled, notepad out, pen in hand. She recovered immediately and gave me the particular smile she uses when she doesn't know what she's walking into and doesn't want to show it. She said, "Nadia, I didn't know you'd been contacted." I said, "I'm a named party." She absorbed that with a very slight change in her expression that she covered by pulling out the chair at the head of the table. Gerald sat to her right. Tara to his right. The quiet husband at the end. I noted that they had arranged themselves like a board. At 2:01, David Carreño walked in. He was in his mid-60s, compact, precise, the kind of man who has probably never been late to a single appointment in his professional life. Gray suit, no tie. Reading glasses he set on the table rather than on his face. He had a file folder in front of him that was not particularly thick, which I would later understand was because the documents in it were well organized rather than absent. He looked around the room. He said, "Thank you all for coming. Before we begin, I want to confirm that Raymond asked me to conduct this meeting in his absence, as his health did not permit him to attend today." My mother said, "Is he all right?" She said it with exactly the right amount of concern. I watched it land and noted it. Carreño said, "He's resting comfortably. He asked me to send his regards." He opened the folder. He said, "I'll move through this in the order Raymond specified. Please hold questions until I've completed the reading." My mother folded her hands on the table. Gerald leaned back slightly in his chair. Tara had a legal pad of her own, which told me she'd brought her own note-taking. She'd come prepared to collect numbers. Carreño read, "I'm going to tell you what was in that," will the way Carreño read it, methodically without theatrical emphasis, which made it more devastating than any dramatic delivery could have. The estate included the following. The property at Millbrook Road, held in the Millbrook Road Family Trust, recorded October 3rd with the county clerk's office, transferred in full to me. Valued at current market assessment of $387,000. A brokerage account held at Vanguard, account established 1978, containing an investment portfolio with a current value of $341,200, transferred to me. A savings account at First Community Bank containing $47,500, transferred to me. A collection of civil engineering reference books, his late wife's china, the yellow ceramic bowl, and the 1987 Honda lawnmower, listed specifically by name, transferred to me. To Margaret, my mother, Raymond left $1. The language in the document was precise. $1, representing the minimum bequest required under state law to confirm that the omission of further assets is intentional and not the result of oversight. Carreño read that sentence without inflection. My mother's face did something I had never seen it do before. It didn't crumple. It didn't rage. It simply stopped. Like a clock that had been running and then wasn't. Gerald's jaw tightened. Tara set her pen down very carefully. The quiet husband looked at the window. Carreño closed the folder. The room was silent for what I counted as 11 full seconds. Then my mother said very quietly, "There must be a mistake." Carreño said, "There is no mistake." She said, "He would never, we discussed." "Mrs. Holt," Carreño said, with a particular gentle firmness of a man who has been doing this for 30 years and has heard every version of this sentence. The documents were prepared, reviewed, and signed by Raymond in full legal capacity. A capacity evaluation was completed by his physician, Dr. Anand Mehta, on September 4th, specifically to preempt any challenge on those grounds. The documentation is complete. My mother looked at me. I don't know what she expected to find in my face. Guilt maybe. Conspiracy. Some evidence that I had engineered this or manipulated a fragile old man. What she found, I think, was just me. Sitting quietly with a notepad and a pen. Exactly where Raymond had told me to be. Gerald said, "We'll be contesting this." Carreño said, You are entitled to pursue that. I can provide you with the relevant procedural information. I will also note that the estate documents include a no contest clause, meaning any legal challenge that fails will result in the forfeiture of the $1 bequest as well. Tara said. That's standard, Carreño said pleasantly. Raymond was very thorough. They left before I did. My mother paused at the door. For a moment I thought she was going to say something real, something underneath the fur coat and the new name and the 18 months of managed distance. I thought she might arrive briefly, at the version of herself that used to braid my hair in Raymond's kitchen. She didn't. She said, I hope you're happy, Nadia. I said, I hope you are too, Mom. She walked out. Carreño waited until the sound of their footsteps disappeared down the stairs. Then he slid a second envelope across the table to me. Thinner than the first. My name again in the same slanted cursive, he said. He asked me to give you this in private. After. I said, I know. He told me to open it after. Carreño nodded. He said, your grandfather was a remarkable man to represent. In 36 years of estate law, I've seen a handful of clients with his particular combination of patience and precision. He came to me in September and said. He paused, allowed himself a brief professional smile. He said, David, I need to make sure that when this is over, the right person is holding the deed. We spent 3 months making sure of exactly that. I said, he knew. He knew what they were planning. He knew in July, Carreño said simply. The barbecue. I nodded that I thanked him. I picked up my notepad, put the envelope back in my blazer pocket, and walked down the stairs and out into the January air, which was cold and bright and somehow felt different than it had that morning. I sat in my car in Carreño's parking lot for a while before I drove anywhere. I didn't open the note yet. I had promised myself I would wait until I was home, until I was back at Millbrook Road in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, which was where Raymond had made every important decision I had ever watched him make. That felt right. What I did instead was call Carreño's office from the parking lot. He had given me his direct line before I left the building. I said, I have some questions about the logistics. The brokerage account. When does transfer of control take effect? He said, it already has. The trust structure Raymond used meant the assets transferred outside of probate. There is no waiting period. As of the date of his passing, which was. He paused. I said, wait. He said gently, Nadia. Raymond passed away on January 18th. 3 days ago. He asked me not to notify you until after the meeting. He was very specific about that. He said, and I am quoting him directly, she'll be steadier in the room if she doesn't know yet. She can be sad after. Tell her I said that. I put my hand over my mouth. I sat there in that parking lot for a long time. Raymond had known he was dying. His cardiologist had given him a prognosis in November. Congestive heart failure, manageable for a time, terminal on a timeline that was measured in weeks rather than years. He had not told me. He had not told my mother. He had spent those weeks doing what he had apparently always done when faced with something large and irreversible. He got his affairs in order with precision and patience, and he made sure the people who deserved protection were protected. He had planned the meeting for January 21st. 3 days after he knew he would be gone. Enough time for the initial shock of his passing to be someone else's. Not mine, not yet. And enough time for the documents to be unassailable. He had ironed the sequence the way I ironed my blazer the night before. Let me tell you what the numbers actually looked like when I had time to sit with them. The brokerage account, $341,200, transferred already, clean, outside of probate. The savings, $47,500. The house, $387,000 in assessed value, though Carreño noted that comparable properties on Millbrook Road had sold recently in the range of $410,000 to $430,000. Total estate transferred to me, Conservatively, just over $775,000. I was 24 years old. I had $11,000 in savings and a student loan balance of $28,400. The numbers rearranged my entire sense of what the next decade of my life looked like. But here's what I want to tell you about those numbers. And I want to say this carefully because I don't want you to hear this as a story about money. The money was not the point. Raymond had not built that portfolio to leave me wealthy. He had built it the way he built everything. Methodically, patiently, for the purpose of ensuring that the right person would be standing on solid ground when the ground around them shifted. He had seen the shift coming. He had prepared for it years before it arrived. And when my mother stood in his living room on Christmas Eve and told him it wasn't his house anymore, he already knew. He had known for months that she was wronged. My mother's attorney, not Carreño, a different firm she'd engaged within 48 hours of the will reading, sent a letter on January 29th. Cited undue influence. It cited Raymond's age. It cited the speed of the trust's preparation. It was, I was told by Carreño when I forwarded it to him, a fairly standard challenge letter and not a particularly strong one, given that Raymond had obtained a physician's capacity evaluation in September specifically to preempt this argument. Carreño responded on February 4th. His response was 11 pages. I did not read all 11 pages, but I read the first 2. And the tone was the written equivalent of a man setting down a very thick file on a table without raising his voice. The challenge was dropped on February 19th. My mother called me that evening. I let it go to voicemail. She said, "Nadia, I think we need to talk. I think there's been a lot of misunderstanding and I'd really like to." I saved the voicemail. I did not call back. There were practical consequences that unfolded over the following weeks that I want to walk you through, because this is the part Raymond had thought through most carefully. Gerald had been storing equipment from one of his dealerships in the detached garage on Millbrook Road. 3 filing cabinets, 2 commercial display units, a parts inventory he'd apparently been keeping there informally for 7 months. No lease agreement. No permission document. No rental arrangement of any kind. Carreño sent a certified letter on February 7th notifying Gerald that the garage was part of the trust property, now under my ownership, and that any stored items not retrieved within 21 days would be considered abandoned property under state statute. Gerald retrieved them in 4 days. He did not ring the front doorbell. Tara's husband, whose name I have now remembered as Dennis, had, it emerged, been in conversation with a real estate agent about listing the Millbrook Road property. He had done this in December before the will reading, apparently at Tara's suggestion, apparently operating under the assumption that the property transfer to my mother was simply a matter of paperwork and time. The agent had done a comparative market analysis and sent it to Dennis's email. I learned about this from the agent herself, who called me in February to introduce herself, and was clearly surprised to discover that the ownership situation was not what Dennis had described. She was professional about it. She apologized for any confusion. I thanked her and told her I'd be in touch if I decided to sell, which I had no intention of doing. I moved back into the house on Millbrook Road on February 22nd. I fixed the button on the gray cardigan before I unpacked anything else. I moved back into Millbrook Road on a Tuesday morning in late February. The house had been empty for 5 weeks. It smelled different, that particular stillness that settles into a space when the person who animated it is gone. Not bad. Just quiet in a way that had weight to it. I stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a long moment before I went in. The yellow ceramic bowl was still on the counter. I don't know why that hit me as hard as it did. I had catalogued it in the estate documents. I had seen it listed in Carreño's file, right there between the china and the lawnmower. One yellow ceramic bowl. And still, seeing it sitting there on the counter in the February morning light, the same place it had sat for every potato salad, every Sunday morning, every ordinary Tuesday of the last 6 years, I had to put my hand on the counter and just breathe for a minute. Raymond had specifically listed that bowl. He had sat with his attorney and said, "Make sure she gets the bowl." That is the kind of man he was. I made coffee. I sat down at the kitchen table. His chair, the one facing the window, and I took the index card out of my blazer pocket. I had carried it for 12 days. Through the will reading, through the parking lot, through the phone call where I learned he was already gone, through the attorney letters and the garage retrieval and the February nights alone in my apartment before the transfer was complete. 12 days with this card in my pocket like a held breath. I read it. I am not going to read it to you word for word. Some things belong to the people they were written for, and Raymond understood that. He wrote 4 lines, not 40, because he knew the difference between what needed to be said and what could be trusted to be understood. But I will tell you the shape of it. He said he was sorry he couldn't be in the room. He said he had watched me for 24 years become someone he was proud of in a way he hadn't always known how to say out loud. He said the house was mine because he had always thought of it as mine, that the address had been as much about me as about him since the Tuesday in March when I was 9 years old and my father left with his guitar. And he said, and this is the line I keep coming back to, the one I think about when things are hard and I need to remember what patience actually looks like in practice, he said. Kindness is not weakness. Don't let anyone ever use your softness as evidence against you. It was always your longest strength. I sat at that table for a long time. The heater clicked on. The February light moved across the floor. The yellow bowl sat on the counter. I cried in the way you cry when grief and gratitude arrive at exactly the same moment and you can't separate them because they were never really separate to begin with. It has been 14 months since that morning. I still live on Millbrook Road. I repainted the back bedroom, not to erase anything, just to make it mine in a way that felt honest. The garden is harder than Raymond made it look, but I'm learning. I found his notes tucked in the garage. Actual handwritten notes about which plants go where and when, with small diagrams and seasonal reminders, because of course he left notes. Of course he thought about the garden too. I paid off my student loans in March. All $28,400. I transferred the money, watched the balance go to zero, and then sat there for about 4 minutes doing nothing because some moments deserve 4 minutes of nothing. I have not had a real conversation with my mother. She has called 6 times. Each call goes to voicemail. Each voicemail contains some version of the same thing. Misunderstanding, family, time heals, let's talk. I save them without responding. Not out of cruelty. Not out of some ongoing campaign to punish her. Simply because I am no longer available for conversations that cost me more than they return. That is not revenge. That is just a boundary I now know how to hold. Gerald and Tara. I have no information about them and no interest in acquiring any. Here's what I want to say to you before I close this out, because I don't tell this story to make myself sound strategic or victorious or better than anyone. I tell it because I spent a long time believing that being the quiet one, the invisible one, the one who absorbed things without making noise. I believed that was a flaw. That the people who demanded space and took things and spoke over you were the ones who understood something about the world that you didn't. Raymond understood something different. He understood that patience is not passivity. That silence is not surrender. That the most powerful thing you can sometimes do is simply continue. To be present, to be decent, to document, to plan, and to trust that the right structure, built carefully enough, will hold even after you're no longer there to defend it. He built that structure over decades. He built it with index funds and a good lawyer and a physician's evaluation and 4 lines on an index card. He built it in the time it took to refill an ice bucket that didn't need refilling. He protected me with the same quiet consistency he used for everything. And what I have now, the house, the cleared debt, the garden I'm still learning, the gray cardigan with a fixed button hanging on the hook by the back door, none of it feels like winning. Feels like being held by something that knew you before you knew yourself. That's what he left me. That was always what he was leaving me. If you've made it this far, thank you. Genuinely. This is not a story I told lightly, and the fact that you stayed with it means something to me. If any part of this resonated, the invisibility, the slow erosion, the moment when you realize the people who were supposed to protect you have been quietly making other plans. I want you to know something Raymond knew before I did. Being underestimated is not a verdict. It is a miscalculation made by someone who wasn't paying close enough attention. If this story hit close to home, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from. I read them. All of them. And if you've ever been the quiet one in your own family, the one who absorbed and accommodated and gave more than you received, I hope you remember that that was never weakness. That was always your longest strength. Subscribe if you want to stay. There are more stories where this one came from. I'll see you in the next one.